Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where you give us your source material. It could be articles, notes, research, and we dive deep to pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah, we basically act as your guides, navigating through all the information to find what really matters.
Absolutely. And today, wow, you've handed us a fascinating stack. We're doing a deep dive into trade and conservation.
That's right. Specifically, how exporting natural ingredients when they're produced sustainably might actually help biodiversity, or, maybe not.
Right. And we're looking at real-world examples from the Helvetas Regional Biotrade Project over in Southeast Asia.
Yep, we've got case studies on Siam benzoin gum and organic chili from Vietnam, Indian prickly ash from Laos, and juju from Myanmar, a real mix.
So our mission here is to unpack the potential versus the reality. How do these specific supply chains actually impact the ecosystems they come from? And can trade genuinely be a tool for conservation? Okay, let's get into it.
So first, maybe a little context on the project itself, the Helvetas Regional Biotrade Project.
Good idea. It's funded by the Swiss government, right?
It is.
Ah.
And the main aim is pretty straightforward. Boost exports of sustainably produced natural ingredients.
How did they do that?
Well, they work with businesses, help them get ready for export, promote the products internationally, and also try to, nudge policies in a more supportive direction.
Okay. And there's this underlying idea, this hope, isn't there?
Yeah, the big idea is that if you trade these ingredients, especially native species that are produced sustainably, it can give people a real economic reason to protect the environment, protect biodiversity.
Makes sense. If the forest pays, you protect the forest.
Exactly. But the sources are also quite clear figuring out the actual biodiversity impact in these really complex real-world ecosystems. It's tough.
Not like a controlled experiment.
Not at all. So these case studies, they rely a lot on careful observation over time, talking to people, trying to piece together the picture qualitatively.
And when they first picked products for the project, the criteria were pretty basic.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Is it native, and does it look like it could sell internationally? Export potential.
So these case studies we're looking at now were designed to go deeper.
Right, to figure out, okay, which specific things about the plant and the way it's grown or harvested actually make the biggest difference for biodiversity. Learning what really works.
Okay, cool. Which brings us neatly to the first example. One, the source's flag is having really high potential. Siam benzoin in Vietnam.
Yes, Siam benzoin. It's a gum. Comes from the Styrax tonkinensis tree.
Has a history in Vietnam, but maybe declined a bit.
Yeah, it did. But this company, DPC, with support from Helvetas starting around 2013, they've been working to revive it, especially for exports since 2017. DPC is the big player now.
And the way they get the gum, that's
Yeah.
important, right? The traditional methods.
Super important. Harvesters make these small cuts in the bark, the sources say about the size of a cigarette box, once a year, usually at the start of the rainy season.
Okay.
Then the gum oozes out, dries on the tree, and they collect it later. The crucial thing is they're not cutting the tree down.
Ah, so the tree can keep living and producing for years if it's done right.
Exactly. You're just harvesting a part of it.
Okay, that sounds promising already. But you mentioned the tree itself has inherent potential. What's special about Styrax tonkinensis?
Well, ecologically, it's pretty interesting. It's native to Vietnam, for starters. And it's actually a dominant tree in the early stages when a forest starts growing back naturally.
Like a pioneer species.
Exactly. It probably gets pollinated by insects, so it supports them. And its little seeds are a key food source, especially for rodents.
And rodents are food for?
Well, for lots of things higher up, predator birds, mammals like civets, maybe even tigers in landscapes where habitats are connected. So the species itself got a decent score, 8 out of 16, just for its natural role.
Okay, so the tree itself is good, but the sources really hammer home that the production system is where the impact swings wildly. Can you break that down?
Absolutely. This is maybe the core finding for benzoin. If you're getting the gum from native forests, where Styrax is just growing naturally as part of a complex ecosystem, the potential for a positive biodiversity impact is high. They scored at 15 out of 26.
Why so high?
Because you're only taking a bit of the plant. The forest structure stays intact. It helps the water cycle. And this is key. It gives local people a direct economic reason to keep that native forest standing.
Right, the incentive we talked about. And the alternative, the contrast.
The contrast is stark. If you grow Styrax in plantations, the potential impact flips to negative. A score of a -11.
-11. Wow, why?
Well, often they're monocultures, just rows of Styrax, maybe a simple mix, and the business model is often linked to timber, not just gum. So periodically, They clear-cut the whole area.
Which destroys the habitat completely.
Totally. Plus, plantations might use chemical fertilizers, herbicides,
Mhm.
bad for soil, bad for water. And there's really no incentive to maintain a complex forest-like structure long-term. You see these pictures of clear cuts on steep slopes. Huge erosion risk, too.
So same tree, same inherent qualities, but the system, native forest versus plantation, makes all the difference. Positive versus negative impact.
Right.
It's huge.
It really is.
What about the wider context in Vietnam? Where is this happening?
Mostly northern Vietnam, and the context is vital. Forest cover there actually went up numerically in recent decades after earlier declines.
Oh, that sounds good.
Well, yes and no. A lot of that increase was these lower quality plantations we just discussed. Meanwhile, Vietnam has incredible biodiversity overall, but it's under massive pressure. Population growth, farming expansion, illegal hunting, the usual suspects.
But there's a potential upside with benzoin in this context.
Yes. Because these styrax areas are often located near existing protected areas, and they contain important forest types, like mountainous evergreen mixed forests.
Ah, so they could connect things.
Exactly. This is where native benzoin harvesting, done right, could be a conservation tool. Healthy thyrax forests, either native ones or really well-managed production forests, could act as buffer zones, or even better, as green corridors.
Linking up those protected areas, why is that so critical there?
Because the sources stress these connections are vital for endangered species. They mention gibbons, wild dogs, pangolins, potentially even tigers. These animals need room to roam, to move between patches of good habitat.
So these corridors are like lifelines.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
And well-managed production landscapes, like sustainable benzoin forests, could provide those links.
Okay, so system and context matter. What about the people involved? The different players in the supply chain? How do they influence things?
Good question. The sources look at a few key groups. The client, the buyer overseas, they mainly want reliable supply, obviously. But they have apparently pushed for practices that align with biotrade ideas. Pricing could potentially be used more to encourage conservation actions.
And the producer, DPC.
They seem committed to things like fair labor, quality control, traceability, which is good. But the sources suggest that actions specifically aimed at the long-term health of the wild trees, or wider biodiversity conservation. That's still developing. Ecological awareness seems a bit low at the company level.
What about the local collectors, the households?
They often have amazing traditional knowledge about local nature. Sometimes they even plant mixed gardens themselves. But, those background threats like illegal logging and hunting are still real issues in these areas.
And the government, forest protection boards.
Their knowledge is often focused just on the official protected areas. They might not know much about the biodiversity in the styrax forests outside those zones. And they seem to lack technical guidance on managing these forests for both production and conservation. Communication with companies needs work, too.
Any role for NGOs?
Yeah, groups like WWF, IUCN are active in Vietnam. They're potential partners. But they might need specific funding to really focus on these secondary forests, like styrax areas, to fully support the project's conservation goals.
Okay, so pulling that all together, what were the main recommendations from the sources to actually boost biodiversity conservation in this benzoin chain?
A few key things. First, better communication. Platforms for the companies, the forest boards, local government to actually talk and collaborate.
Makes sense.
Second, more research. Support studies to actually document the biodiversity in these styrax areas, especially near protected zones. Use things like camera traps, but also talk to locals, including hunters. Combine that traditional knowledge with scientific data.
Right, get the full picture. What else?
Work directly with the producers, the collectors, to figure out practical actions they can take to boost biodiversity, maybe even in plantations,
Okay.
like mixing in other useful plants.
Okay.
And crucially, talk to the forest protection boards and other experts to figure out how to manage styrax sustainably within native forests, given the existing logging bans. It's not about converting native forest, but managing it for sustainable harvest and ecosystem health. Connectivity is key.
Finding that sweet spot. Okay, let's shift gears completely. A very different picture with the second case study. Organic chili, also in Vietnam. This one was picked knowing it probably had lower potential, right?
That's right. Helvetas supported a company called DACE to get organic certification for chili and some other crops. And yeah, the inherent potential assessment for chili itself was slightly negative, -1 out of 16.
Why negative?
Mostly because chili, Capsicum frutescens, isn't native to Vietnam. It's originally from Latin America. So its natural role in the local ecosystem is basically zero.
Okay. And how does the production system stack up, even when it's organic?
Well, comparing organic and conventional chilies side by side, the sources say both have pretty significant limitations for biodiversity at the field level.
How so?
Both are monocultures, just chili plants. Very low plant diversity right there. And for both, the whole plant gets removed after harvest, wiping out any temporary habitat it might have offered. Both scored Meta 2 on those points.
And they block wildlife movement, too.
Yes, also rated Meta 2. Now, organic is definitely better than conventional in some key ways.
Like avoiding chemicals.
Exactly. No chemical pesticides or fertilizers. That's good for the immediate soil and water quality and helps local insects compared to conventional. Organic also adds some biomass back to the soil, but the plant itself doesn't have deep roots. It's an annual crop. Its positive contribution is limited.
And conventional.
Conventional involves mechanical tilling, artificial fertilizers, which can mess up soil health long term, and yeah, heavy chemical use. The sources mention worries about unregulated pesticides coming over the border, some really toxic stuff banned in Europe, and people maybe not using them correctly.
So much worse impacts.
Much worse. Conventional scored -21 overall compared to organic's -2. So organic is clearly less harmful, much less harmful.
Yeah.
But the basic system monoculture, annual non-native, still means it has very low potential to actively add biodiversity value.
Okay, less bad is good, but it's not actively good for biodiversity overall. And where are these fields? Sensitive spots?
No, the sources say they're mostly in agricultural valleys, surrounded by conventional farms. And the organic chili plots studied were pretty small, only about 6.5 hectares total.
So tiny islands of organic in a sea of conventional ag.
Pretty much. Relatively isolated, limited scale.
What about the people involved here? The company, the consumers?
The company, DACE, seems focused on that organic label mainly for market access. But interestingly, the sources say their organic yields are low, so they're not actually getting much of a price premium yet. Their strategy seems to be more about quantity right now.
And consumers, are they buying organic chili for biodiversity?
Not really, according to the sources. It's mainly health reasons driving interest in organic. And awareness about soil or water pollution issues seem pretty low among the company and the organic farming groups.
Is the technical support focused on biodiversity?
No, it's geared towards meeting the organic certification standards, what you can and can't use. Not really about specific measures to enhance biodiversity.
And even a key organic practice like adding biomass to soil wasn't always fully done.
Yeah, apparently not by all producers, which limits even those small potential benefits for soil health.
So the bottom line for organic chilies seems to be
That organic certification, on its own, doesn't automatically mean big biodiversity wins. It's better because it avoids harmful chemicals, which helps locally.
Right.
But the system itself, non-native, annual monoculture, whole plant removal, just has inherent limits for contributing to wider biodiversity. The impact seen so far was low.
if the potential is low, what do they recommend? Just stop.
Not necessarily stop, but recognize the limitations. They suggested getting stakeholders together to brainstorm ways to maybe increase biodiversity while also improving productivity. Perhaps things like companion planting or planting hedgerows around the fields. Little things.
Okay.
And they spotted a potential link to the region's status as a UNESCO geopark. Maybe connect the organic farming to that. Could boost tourism, create a greener image for the whole area, and potentially open up markets willing to pay more.
Leveraging other local assets. Interesting. Okay, let's move to Laos. Case study 3. Indian prickly ash, described as having context-dependent potential. What's that about?
Right, Indian prickly ash, Xanthoxylum redsa. It's a tree, and they're looking at exporting its fruit capsules for the perfume industry, working with a company called Dacday.
And the context part.
It comes from where this tree naturally grows, which is in the fallow periods of traditional Swidden agriculture landscapes. Slash and burn.
So it grows when the land is resting after being farmed.
Exactly. And the sources say it does best when the fallow period is between 8 and 15 years. Too short or too long, and it doesn't thrive. So its fate is tied directly to that whole agricultural cycle.
And harvesting it from those natural fallows wasn't always great.
Often destructive, yeah. People might cut the whole tree down just to get the fruit easily. Plus, they'd collect unripe fruit. And with pressure on land shortening those fallow cycles, that traditional method is becoming unsustainable.
Okay, so that's the problem context. Where's the potential?
The potential comes from an alternative system farmers developed. They started converting patches of fallow land that already had prickly ash into managed gardens.
How does that work?
They basically weed out the competing plants, which makes the prickly ash trees grow better and produce more fruit. The trees live longer too, maybe 20, 25 years. And they manage a cycle of regeneration within these gardens.
Ah, so the potential depends heavily on which system you're talking about, destructive harvesting from shrinking fallows or these managed gardens.
Precisely. That's the context dependency.
What about the tree itself? Any inherent plus points?
Yeah, it's native species, which is good. It's dioecious, separate male and female trees, and farmers know how to manage the ratio to get good pollination.
Pollinated by.
Insects, mainly bees. And the seeds get spread by birds, like bulbuls, so it supports those local ecological interactions.
And the practices in the managed gardens sound much better.
Definitely more sustainable than just hacking down trees and fallows. Farmers harvest only the fruit, they manage the trees. It helps preserve the genetic diversity of the species locally. And, importantly, no external inputs are used. No chemical fertilizers, no pesticides.
How do they keep the soil fertile then in these gardens?
Another key bit of context. Cattle graze in the gardens during the dry season. Their manure helps maintain fertility.
Interesting synergy.
Yeah. And there are also village land use plans that help stop all the forests being turned into gardens, so it maintains more of a mixed landscape.
Okay, economically, how important is this prickly ash for the farmers? Is it a big earner?
The sources say selling the fruit itself is actually a fairly minor part of household income in the study villages, maybe 9 to 23%, compared to things like growing rice, weaving, raising livestock. It's not huge.
Are they selling all they could?
Probably not. Seems like market limitations mean they're only selling maybe 5 to 20% of their potential harvest.
But wait, you mentioned the livestock and the cattle grazing in the gardens.
Exactly. This is crucial. Because the gardens provide that valuable grazing land, they contribute significantly to the livestock income. So if you look at the total income derived from these managed garden areas, the fruit sales, plus the value of the grazing for livestock, it becomes much more substantial for households, maybe up to 38% in one village studied.
Ah, okay. So the combined value makes maintaining these gardens and the trees much more attractive.
Yes, that linkage seems really important for why people maintain this system.
What about quality? You mentioned perfume.
Yeah, quality is key for that market, and it varies a lot depending on the location, microclimate. Soil seem to matter, and whether they harvest the fruit when it's properly mature. Locals have their own criteria: aroma, size, color. Some villages are known as hot spots for producing the best quality.
Is quality checked early?
Apparently not. The buyer, a French company, assesses it late in the game, after export. That's a risk for everyone earlier in the chain. The sources suggest doing some preliminary testing locally could help.
And traceability, knowing where it came from.
No system yet, but the buyer needs one for export, so that's something that will need to be developed.
Okay, so summing up prickly ash. The managed gardens, while maybe simpler than primary forest, are way more sustainable than the old harvesting methods. They offer an alternative income, potentially easing pressure on other forests, and focusing on those hotspot villages makes sense because quality is linked to location.
That's a good summary, yeah. It's about finding the best context within the existing system.
Right. Last case study, jujube in Myanmar. What's the story there?
Okay, jujube trees. We're in Myanmar's central dry zone. Two main types, Chinese sweet and Indian sour. The focus here is on the sour Indian jujube, Ziziphus mauritiana, specifically a variety called Zichin.
And what's that used for?
Syrup from the fruit, but also the seed endosperm, the inside of the seed.
Where do the trees grow? Wild? Farmed?
Mostly wild, but kind of managed in forest areas. Some are domesticated too. The land might belong to villagers or the forest department.
And how is it collected? Sustainably?
Generally, yes. The practices are described as sustainable. Farmers usually just gather the fruit after it falls naturally. Sometimes they use hooked sticks to pull branches down, which can break some. But apparently, regeneration isn't hampered. The forest department seems okay with the current methods.
Any other management?
Yeah, farmers prune older trees, ones over 30 years old, to encourage new growth from the roots, which sounds like sensible management.
Is there much demand for this sour juju?
Actually, yes. Demand for the seed endosperm, which goes into traditional Chinese medicine and gets exported to China and Korea, is increasing.
And what effect is that having?
It's actually leading to an increase in the presence of this specific native sour variety in the landscape. Farmers see it as more valuable than some other cash crops because it provides a stable income with low inputs.
So market demand is literally making this native species more common. That sounds positive.
It's a positive for the species itself, yeah. So points for sustainable collection and market demand boosting a native species.
But, I sense a but. Were there downsides observed?
There were several localized negative environmental things. Plastic waste dumping is a big problem, especially along roadsides. It affects the soil, and there's no real waste management.
Ugh, yeah.
Also, sand extraction from rivers is making them narrower, messing with water supply and levels, and erosion makes it worse.
Water issues. Okay. Anything else?
Sometimes cash crops are grown right around the jujube trees, so it's not always a pure forest setting. And climate impacts were noted. Really cold winters or long droughts can hurt the flowers and reduce the fruit harvest. Vulnerability there.
Pollinators mentioned.
Yep, bees are pollinators, so their health matters for fruit production too.
So, wrapping up jujube's contribution to biodiversity.
The sources concluded it's limited overall. Sustainable fruit collection, good. Market demand increasing the presence of this native species, also plus for the species itself. But these localized negative impacts, waste, water stress, surrounding agriculture, kind of counteract the benefits. It's a mixed bag.
Okay. So, bringing all four of these cases together now, benzoin, chili, prickly ash, jujube, it really hammers home that this link between trading natural stuff and helping biodiversity, it's complicated.
It really is. Super variable. We saw that potential contribution ranged massively.
Right. Highest was Siam benzoin, but specifically from native forests. Perennial, native, only harvest part of it. It's in a natural ecosystem. Can even help connect habitats. Ticks a lot of boxes.
Then you had moderate potential with Indian prickly ash in those managed gardens. Again, native perennial harvest part of it, but the system itself is simplified compared to a real forest. Still, its big plus was offering a better alternative to destructive harvesting.
And benzoin in plantations also fell somewhere in that middle ground. Better than chili? Maybe. But way worse than native forest benzoin.
Exactly. And in the lowest potential was clearly the organic chili, non-native, annual crop, monoculture system. You remove the whole plant, it acts as a barrier.
The benefits were really just local, right? Avoiding chemicals in that specific patch of soil and water. Small scale.
Pretty much. And this really drives home the point. It's not just about whether the species is native or not.
It's the production system in the whole context, isn't it? How fragile is the ecosystem? What's happening on the land around it? That seems almost more important than the plant's inherent qualities sometimes.
Absolutely. Those factors can completely change the outcome.
So, looking back at the project's experience across all these, what were the big lessons learned, according to the sources?
A few really stand out. First, product selection needs to be smarter from the get-go. Consider that inherent biodiversity potential more explicitly, beyond just, is it native and can we sell it? Maybe do quick biodiversity checks on potential products early on.
Okay, what else?
Buyers. They have market power, sure, but they don't always prioritize deep biodiversity conservation. They might focus on marketable things like organic, which is good, but might not require specific actions for biodiversity beyond just avoiding chemicals. And, buyers want stable supply, which is tough when there are thousands of potential ingredients out there.
True. What about the producers on the ground?
They're absolutely crucial. Biodiversity conservation ultimately happens, or doesn't happen, in their hands. They need more support, more knowledge, blending their traditional insights with scientific understanding to actually develop and implement biodiversity action plans that make sense for them.
So the project needs stronger partnerships with conservation groups.
Yes, exactly, to provide that kind of tailored support. And finally, policy. Policies need to genuinely support biodiversity, not just economic growth or trade volume. There's a need to build capacity within government agencies on this.
So the conclusion wasn't that the project failed, but more that it's having some positive effects, but could do much better.
Yeah, that's the gist. Some positive impacts, definitely, but lots of room for improvement. Short term, maybe focus more support on the high potential products like those from native forests, and perhaps phase out support where the potential for real biodiversity impact seems inherently very low.
And long term.
A more integrated approach. Look at the whole system, the market dynamics, all the different players, all the constraints to figure out how to make a more substantial systemic difference for both people and nature in the next phase.
Okay, so the big takeaway here really is that the connection between trade and biodiversity isn't simple at all. It really hinges on the specific species, yes, but maybe even more on how it's grown or collected and the state of the ecosystem around it.
Right, and it seems like native species, especially when they're part of production systems that kind of mimic or support natural processes, like the native forest benzoin, hold the most promise for genuinely positive outcomes.
And trade can support conservation.
It can, but it really requires deliberate, conscious choices and actions from everyone. From the local collectors right through the supply chain to the companies, the buyers, consumers, and policymakers. It doesn't just happen automatically.
Which leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. Thinking about these really different examples, the benzoin showing how system design is crucial, the chilies showing the limits of just a label like organic, the prickly ash offering better alternatives, the jujube facing modern pressures like plastic waste. How can you, when you interact with global supply chains through the things you buy, the companies you support, how can you help push for and support those value chains that are genuinely trying to benefit the environment, not just ticking a box or offering a simple certification?